I have an Aberystwyth connection with Richard Jackson as well, who I consider a great friend. He's a very impressive person and a scholar that I'd like to, I hope I can emulate in my career as well. Admire him very much. I should begin with a little bit of an apology. I'm very sorry I couldn't join you yesterday. I did arrive at about 3 o'clock or something like that, but I was so exhausted from the travel from China that I couldn't face coming here. I didn't think I'd be of much use, so I didn't come. I just tried to relax a little bit. And if you download my paper, which is on the conference website, you'll notice it has more than a couple typos. I was under a bit of pressure beforehand to try to do funding application, and so the fine-tuning of the paper was delayed a little bit, and it was still a bit rough around the edges. I was reviewing it last night as I prepared my PowerPoint, and I thought it was a bit painful, all the typos. I was like, oh my god. But nevertheless, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm grateful that you've chosen our presentation, our panels, our presentations, our panel to sit in on. So I'm going to talk about the Libya intervention of 2011 and British foreign policy and decision making, and how I think the British approach to the crisis should be understood. This is just a bit of essential background because I know that not everyone studies humanitarian intervention questions or contemporary conflicts. But you may remember that in 2011, as a part of the Arab Spring, I guess you could say too, there was a revolution in Tunisia, then a revolution in Egypt. There was other simultaneous revolutions going on, or unrest going on in Bahrain and in Syria as well, and especially, most notably for me, in Libya. Mass protests began against Muammar Gaddafi in middle February 2011. The crisis there was marked by a brutal, sensational, theatrical almost threat by Muammar Gaddafi, and brutal repression by him as he attempted to control the unrest. But some of this was provoked by violent extremists amongst the protesters too. In fact, that's an important part of my narrative, that it isn't necessarily the case that he was dealing with peaceful protesters and was brutally attacking civilians all the time. That isn't the only thing that can be said, though that was a part of it. He was in fact trying to defend his state against violent revolution, and I think did it a little bit incompetently, but he was portrayed, described, characterized as a criminal murderer, basically, who must leave power, and if he doesn't, he should be forced out. And so his response from very early on led to international calls for him to resign, and to efforts to push him out of power if he did not. A coalition led by the United Kingdom, France, and the United States intervened on the 19th of March with ironclad legal approval to do so in the form of the UN Security Council Resolution 1917 that was passed 2 days before. The coalition transferred control to operational command, I guess you could say, to NATO at the end of March. So that's why, if you're familiar with the case in some details, you might think of it as being always NATO operations happening and things like that. In fact, NATO led it from the end of March, but the backbone of it always remained these three powers. My research question, though, after that essential introduction is why did the UK government, David Cameron, decide to intervene in Libya? It might, on the face of it, seem like an obvious question. Obviously, they wanted to respond to Gaddafi's brutality, stop the human rights and humanitarian abuses that were taking place in the country. But I don't think it is as simple as that. And in fact, I don't think that was the primary or even the main reason why the United Kingdom engaged in the crisis and ultimately intervened against Gaddafi as well. I would argue that the Cameron government believed that the successful completion of the political transition that had been begun by the Libyan revolutionaries to a post-Qaddafi era in Libya, at least post-Muammar Gaddafi era, was in the UK government's interests and in British national interests. To see that process completed, to be visibly and actively involved in encouraging that process along in Libya, the British government believed that it could improve its credibility and British interests in the region if it assisted that and pushed it along. And I think that's what the Cameron government wanted to do. Now, in the paper, I present a revisionist historical narrative. I see the crisis not simply as a humanitarian human rights crisis, but more as a debate between the Cameron and Gaddafi governments over the future of Libya's government. The debate escalated several times to military intervention. And then, using some IR theory as well, the paper offers an explanation for Britain's role. Why did they get involved if it wasn't simply this humanitarian narrative that we're probably used to? Why then did Britain get involved? Well, I've explained that I see it as being a connection of Cameron government's political interest and their perception of what the British national interest was. And I explain those interests, including the relevance of the concept that Rich Ned Lebeau has developed about the importance of national spirit and this feeling of national standing, and how that is really important in explaining why states go to war. I should emphasize, though, that I'm not trying to imply that there was no humanitarian crisis in Libya, or to downplay what was happening there, or to imply that Gaddafi was a nice man and that we should forgive him and forgive him and apologize or whatever. He didn't really mean to say mean things. He didn't mean to kill people, things like that. I'm not trying to sugarcoat him. He was, of course, a terrible person. And his forces did kill hundreds of civilians in their brutal attempt to repress the revolutionaries in Libya. There's no question about that, and no one should imagine that I think that that didn't happen, or we should think it is not being important. I think it is important, of course. But the key thing is how all this was being defined. How do we understand it? What was happening there? And I would argue that the British and the French and the Americans defined what was happening in Libya as being a brutal humanitarian action, a type of mass homicide or something like that, attacking civilians, civilians not being protected, their voices being quashed and things like that. But while some of that was happening, Gaddafi was also trying to restore order. He simply wanted to get the status quo back in place. He was responding to lots of violent extremists who were attacking his state, killing and murdering police officers and security forces, stealing guns from armories, causing gun battles and things like that. He was trying to restore order. Now, his forces did so, I would argue, incompetently and in a ham-fisted, unprofessional sort of way, I think. And Gaddafi made things far more worse by, in speeches, talking about terrible punishment that he would met out to those who continued to use armed demonstrations against him. His speeches, like a lot of his actions, were selectively interpreted to imply that he wanted generalized killing and massacre of anyone who opposed him. I would argue that he never intended anything like that. He wanted to stop the opposition to his rule, but he was not interested in widespread massacre, never had a general campaign for general homicide or anything like that. He simply wanted to restore the status quo. But it was presented quite differently. I contrast this actually with the case of Ratko Mladic, the former Bosnian Serb general. This is obviously a bit of a tangent, but perhaps you've been following the news. Just the other day, he was convicted of genocide for his actions as the leader in Srebrenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina, of course. He was just given a life sentence for that yesterday, I believe it is. And Mladic really did that. But Gaddafi, he did kill hundreds of civilians, and that's completely unacceptable, but he did not want to slaughter hundreds of thousands or thousands of people or anything like that. He was simply trying to restore order. The British characterized what he was doing as a type of attempt to slaughter innocent civilians, peacefully protesting his rule, and that wasn't correct either. So this debate, I think, is actually what was really going on behind the surface. Underneath the humanitarian human rights narrative that the British government and others provided, and underneath Gaddafi's own competing narrative, he said that he was fighting Islamic terrorists that were trying to take over his country and so forth. That's also, I think, spacious. But there was certainly a lot of armed extremist violence that he was coping with. Underneath that was a debate between these two leaders that was going on. They weren't, of course, talking directly to each other, but they were arguing with each other about what was going to happen in the future for Libya. It was a series of escalations in this debate that escalated from diplomatic coercion, diplomatic interventions, to military intervention in the course of only 6 weeks. It started with Gaddafi being denounced and being told to leave. This was said even earlier by the French government of Nicolas Sarkozy. In the British case, it didn't begin until about February 28, 2011, because it was at that time that the last of the British workers who were trapped in Libyan oil fields were finally evacuated. It took the British government some weeks to finally coordinate all of that. And actually, as a bit of an aside, if you wanted to look at some of the evidence that might point to how Gaddafi was actually a rule-following, rule-abiding actor, much more than he appears to be in the received narrative that we have, is if he was a crazy person who was bent on holding back the world and killing everybody who opposed him, he probably would have been pretty smart to have kept all these British workers and French workers and stuff like that hostage in those oil fields as a way of keeping the international community out. But he didn't do that. He let them go from airports in Tripoli. And if you think my idea about capturing the workers and holding them hostage is absurd, that's exactly what the Bosnian Serbs did. It worked great. NATO's bombing stopped. He didn't do that. He let them leave. But so right after the British workers were evacuated, Cameron said, we have to, Gaddafi has to go. His forces are attacking civilians. He has lost legitimacy and he must go immediately. His regime is described as a murderous regime. Cameron said he never supported the man and wanted a new government there. That didn't have any immediate effect. Gaddafi's regime, it looked doomed at first anyway. The revolutionaries had forced Gaddafi's forces out of Benghazi, which was their sort of capital in the eastern part of the country, and were actually advancing in all sorts of civilian vehicles across the country in a series of chaotic armed battles with weapons that they had taken from various government caches and things like that. So at first it looked like Gaddafi's government was going to collapse anyway, but it did not. It sort of stabilized itself, it found its footing. And so not so long after February 28th, it escalated again, I would say, with the Cameron government reminding Gaddafi of his of legal consequences. The crisis was referred to the International Criminal Court in the UN Security Resolution 1970 on the 26th of February, and the government would frequently remind Gaddafi through public statements that international law has a long reach and a long memory. They use that sort of expression a lot. Legal consequences for you if you don't stop what you're doing and leave. And they also started to begin to talk about military planning and preparations for what was called a no-fly zone. which sort of involves the kind of occupation of Libya's airspace. It's the denial of the Libyan government of the right to use its airspace for any type of military aircraft. This was the same sort of thing that was done in Bosnia. And Cameron said that he had instructed his military to begin planning with allies, and that he was going to ask NATO to also look into this sort of activity. The next stage, though, was the actual intervention, and this was necessary because by the early part of March, Gaddafi's forces and government had really started to rally and find themselves again. They started to counterattack the revolutionary forces, which by this point had tried to organize themselves into sorts of militias and fighting groups and so forth. And there was more regular sorts of battles taking place along this coastal road between Benghazi in the east and Tripoli in the west. And Gaddafi's forces were proving to be very successful in pushing back the revolutionaries. So successful, in fact, that from about the 6th of March or so to the 15th, 16th of March or so, basically the revolutionaries had been completely defeated, except for they still held on to Benghazi, and there was like a couple blocks in a major city called Misrata that they hadn't taken over, and a few other scattered places where revolutionaries were still active, but they'd almost been completely defeated. And so, plainly, Gaddafi had said, "You want me to leave? No, I'm not leaving, because I have a right to be here, I'm defending my state, and I'm demonstrating that I'm effectively able to restore order, and I'm going to do that right now by finishing off the revolutionaries in Benghazi." He unwisely then took to the air and made another speech about how he was going to show no mercy to those who continued to offer armed resistance to him, that he was going to take care of the Islamic terrorists that he thought were responsible and so forth. Another speech that was received extremely negatively and fed into this perception that Gaddafi was, when he took over Benghazi, going to perpetrate another grisly massacre. It fed into that. His speech was used in that respect, and I think might have been rather important in convincing the United States to finally agree to permit an intervention to take place, because from early March until mid-late February, the United States had been the main reason why there hadn't been an intervention resolution earlier, because it had not been convinced that a no-fly zone would work. It didn't think it was suitable in a